Thank you very much, Emily. There's going to be a little bit of echoing here as we repeat some of these ideas and themes from the first two talks, but I hope you'll bear with me. I've actually just got one slide, and I just want to tell you in advance that it's something I saw on a friend's T-shirt. Okay? Get the message? Okay, so what I want to say tonight really is that there are two types of people. There are people in the church, and there are people who are not in the church. Now, that's not terribly profound, but because our first speaker did elucidate that it's a much more complicated picture than that. But I want to, broadly speaking, confine my remarks to two things. First of all, that there are the people who are in the church in some way or other, and there are people who are outside the church. And I want to say also that there are two reasons, basically, why the church and science need to engage with one another. Perhaps I'll try to use different words than dialogue. The first reason for the people who are inside the church is that, as we've already heard, that understanding science will lead to enhancing faith and our worship, because when we understand more about the creation that we see around us and in the distant parts of the universe, we get a picture of a much bigger God, not the sort of narrow, nationally tribal God that we sometimes see in the Old Testament. But even there, we get allusions to the one who was their God of the Hebrews was also the one who created the whole universe. We get that right at the very beginning. So understanding science enhances our understanding of God and his greatness, enhances our worship and our faith. The second reason is that for people who are churchgoers or even committed Christians as well, knowing more about science, understanding its nature in particular, helps develop a robust faith. And that's important in a world which is essentially antagonistic to the church. It helps us develop a robust faith that will enable us to defend what we believe against militant atheist attacks. And in particular, it will also equip the saints in their outreach to the world around us. So in terms of that first reason, enhancing our faith and worship, the first thing it does really is to help us read the Bible wisely. It's worth remembering that right from the earliest days of the church, whatever we want to describe it, the early church fathers approached the Bible in a number of different ways. And they had no shame or qualms about using what we would today call evidence-based reasoning to understand the Bible. They used their minds to think about reality as they saw it, to help them understand what was metaphor, what was allegory, what was history, and what kind of history it was, and so on. So they used their common sense, if you like, and all the gifts that God had given them to help interpret the Bible, because that really is part of what lies at the core of the conflict thesis. A mutually agreed misunderstanding of what the Bible is, both from many religious people and also from many non-religious people. The Bible is not science. It was never meant to be by the original authors, and the original hearers of the Bible and readers of it didn't expect it to be giving scientific explanations either. So, as we've just heard, actually, we can think of science as telling us answers to the questions about how, the mechanisms. One way of thinking about it is that, as Rabbi Jonathan Sacks puts it in his wonderful book, The Great Partnership, which I recommend to everybody, that science takes things apart to see how they work. Religion puts things together to see what they mean. So they're really answering different questions about the same reality, and that's the message that really we want to get across. And that will help us in the church understand our faith better and build a more robust faith. And that will be important also for our witness to the skeptical and cynical world outside. Because, of course, the second real reason why we need to engage in this conversation, nearly said dialogue, The reason why we need to think about how these two relate is that the church has a mission. Our Lord gave us a mission to the world, to go into all the world and to make disciples. And we have this lovely example of how to do that in the New Testament, in particular in Paul's missionary journeys. And when he arrives in Athens, we all know the story when he gets in Acts 17, where he arrives in Athens and is invited to speak at the Areopagus, where he interacts with the philosophers of the day, the Stoics and the Epicureans. And he starts where they are, about their religiosity and so on, and leads them towards Christ. But the thing that we often miss about that story is that that's actually not where he started. He started in the marketplace in Athens. He started talking to ordinary people, and he kind of earned the right to be invited to that more academic forum to explain his belief. So we've got to be out there meeting people, understanding their worldview, how they think about things, even how they think about the Bible, how they think about what science is, and why they think there's a conflict there at all. Because it's actually very interesting that if we start to think about how we approach the people, the second group, those who are outside the church, who don't see things the way we do, I think there are two reasons there, again, why it's important that we understand the relationship between science and faith. And the first one is that we need to be able to convince those millions of people out there, billions of people, who labor under this misconception that they have been sold a lie. They have been sold an untruth, that there is an inherent conflict between science and faith. There has been tensions about certain aspects throughout history, that's certainly true, but the real conflict stems from fairly recent developments in the late 19th century, in North America in particular. But we're faced with that. That's the way the world we now live in, that there's a pervading view out there that science and faith are in conflict. When I was at Faraday Institute a year or two ago, I was engaged partly in a bit of sociological research, and the folk at Theos, Nick Spencer and his team, did a very wide-ranging survey of the UK population and what they thought about science and religion. And the same number came up, actually, about two-thirds. I think the figure was actually 67%, which is pretty close to two-thirds for a physicist. Two-thirds, 2 in 3 people thought that science and faith were in conflict, they were incompatible. But the interesting thing was, and the whole conclusion of that whole study was that the whole issue is, as we were hearing at the beginning, is much more complicated, it's much more nuanced than that. Because when you ask these people who think that science and faith are in conflict, well, what about physics and faith? Oh no, that's all right. What about chemistry and faith? Yeah, there's no problem there. And what about biology and faith? Well, okay, it's okay. When you're actually talking about specific sciences, they didn't seem to have any problem. There was just some notion, some idea that science per se was against faith. And so really what the problem was more not science itself, but a naturalistic assumption that nature is all there is. There's no such thing as spiritual reality. And that because science only deals with physical reality, that's all there is. But of course, you can immediately see the fault in that logic, of course. The confusion between the methods of science and its philosophy. Methodological naturalism is not the same as ontological naturalism, to use the big words, okay? So people mix up the methods of science with the underlying philosophy of it. So the first thing that we want to tell people of the two things out there in the world is that you're laboring under a misconception. There's no inherent issue of conflict between science and faith. They are looking at the same reality from different aspects, different perspectives, different dimensions of it. And the second thing I think is important to get across to them is that they need have no fear that they have to abandon their rational faculties. That in fact, when you look into science, in particular science as I come as a physicist, and intimated earlier that it gives us a bigger picture of God, who created the universe, is much bigger than even folk are able to think about or contemplate. But the other interesting thing about being a physicist is you get to understand the difference between physics and metaphysics, and how to spot when some of our colleagues tread take that step from physics to metaphysics. And we should say, no, you can't do that. Physics is at the more fundamental level of sciences, and therefore, there's a lovely story that Eric van Auken tells us about in his accounts of his life in Oxford, when he met C.S. Lewis. And he went around with a group of students, and he noticed that quite a number of the Christians were scientists, and quite a lot of those scientists were physicists. And he came to the conclusion that the reason for that was that the biologists thought that they didn't have all the answers, but the chemists did. Basically, biology can be reduced to chemistry. But the chemists thought, well, no, really, fundamentally it's physics. And so we don't have the answers, but the physicists do. And of course, the physicists know we don't have the answers because we can't answer that kind of question. And therefore, physicists are more open, if you like, to see the nature of science as it really is. And interestingly also, I think, from my own personal perspective, the kind of odd things you find as a physicist, the non-commonsensical nature of reality, allows you and stretches your mind and opens them to possibilities. So the fact that we can think of a light as both a wave and a particle, two mutually exclusive things, as being one entity, has the analogy in the Trinity. We can think of God being three in one. So physics breaks our minds, if you like, from that narrow common sense view of reality and opens us to more possibilities. And I think that's what we can do as scientists who are Christians. Get out there and tell people that they're laboring under a misconception. And actually, when you look at it, science is full of evidence that points back to a rational order of things, a creator. The fact that we have laws of nature means there's a lawgiver inherently. And therefore, there's lots of evidence there, not proof, but pointers to the existence of a mind and a personal mind behind the universe, that we can fit all our observations and make sense of it. We build up a coherent, rational picture, and that our faith is rationally justified. And so coming back again to the church, how do we encourage our brothers and sisters in the church of whatever denomination that science is not to be feared, is to be welcomed as a gift of God? We need to understand it. We need to be able to explain it and how it relates to our faith to the folk out there who are laboring under these misconceptions. So we've got to get our brothers and sisters to trust us first as fellow Christians. This is important, I think. When we're accepted as fellow believers, then we can listen to one another and do that humbly and graciously. And then make ourselves able to use the facilities that things like Christians in Science can provide, the kind of literature that we've seen earlier on the slides, and the wealth of speakers and talents in the various subjects that we can provide to help churches both internally enhance their faith and worship, but also in outreach. So let me finish there. I think I'm just inside my time. Thank you very much. Thanks.